She laughed loud enough for the entire royal ballroom to hear, mocking Keanu Reeves as if he didn't belong. But what she didn't know was that her cruel words would backfire in front of the world. And when Prince William walked in, the truth shattered everything. What happened next left the crowd speechless. Before we continue this incredible story, let us know where you're watching from. If you enjoy stories like this, subscribe to the channel, because tomorrow we have another inspiring story you won't want to miss. The grand marble entryway of the Royal Horizon Gala shimmered beneath a canopy of light. Every surface gleamed like it had been polished for royalty, which of course it had. Outside, the line of luxury vehicles curved elegantly along the circular drive, their doors opening to reveal the world's most powerful names in politics, art, philanthropy, and legacy wealth. Valets stood stiff in tailored black suits, whisking away keys from the hands of oil magnates, duchesses, and media moguls, each guest arriving in a display of opulence designed to dazzle. Clare Whitmore had timed her entrance perfectly. Always a strategist, always 10 steps ahead. Her silver gown caught the camera flashes like a mirror catching moonlight. Pearls dripped from her neck in careful layers, and her heels tapped the polished floor with sharp precision. She nodded subtly to the photographers, flashing the kind of smile that had landed her on society pages for 20 years. Every detail was planned, every step choreographed. She was not just attending the royal gala, she was the event. But as she neared the check-in station beneath the gilded archway, her eyes caught on something that didn't belong. A man stood alone, a few paces ahead of her in the guest line. He wore dark jeans, a simple black t-shirt, and sneakers that looked like they'd been walked in, not displayed. No cufflinks, no tuxedo, no tie, no glint of designer logos, just stillness, quiet, waiting. He didn't shift his weight nervously, didn't fidget or check his phone. He stood as if time had no claim on him. Claire's brow lifted slightly. She leaned toward the young woman at the guest check-in holding the digital tablet. Her voice was low, sweet, and practiced, the kind that sounded polite but was sharp enough to cut. "Is there a side entrance for deliveries?" she asked, nodding toward the man. The young woman blinked in confusion. "I'm sorry, ma'am." Claire smiled tightly. "That man. I assume he's here to drop something off. Catering or flowers, perhaps?" The woman glanced at the man, who stood just ahead of the velvet rope. Before she could answer, the scanner chirped. The man had just tapped his invitation. "Valid. Priority guest," the device confirmed in a crisp, automated voice. The staffer stepped aside. "Welcome, sir." The man gave a small nod and walked through the rope into the main hall, silent and unbothered. Claire's smile faltered. "Excuse me," she said, voice a touch more firm. "Who was that?" "He's on the royal guest list," the woman replied. "Special invitation." Claire didn't respond. She only turned, her heels sharp against the stone floor, and entered the ballroom behind him. But her expression had shifted. It was the first time in a long time she didn't know what game was being played. And worse, who the opponent really was. Inside, the ballroom was a world of golden light and orchestral grandeur. Columns reached skyward like marble trees, their surfaces etched with gold leaf and crowned with sculpted angels. Waiters moved like shadows across the floor, balancing trays of champagne flutes that sparkled beneath towering chandeliers. Each table was a portrait of extravagance, with crystal, silver, and orchids flown in from halfway across the world. This was not simply a gala, it was a spectacle. Claire walked through it like she owned it. In a way, she did. She had chaired the planning committee for 5 years straight. Her name was on the donor wall, her photo in every press kit. People nodded as she passed, murmured her name with respectful tones, and moved subtly aside to give her the aisle. She was used to being the sun around which the room orbited. But as she neared the VIP table, the one closest to the stage, the one marked with the royal crest, she came to a sudden stop. He was already there, the man in the black t-shirt, seated right next to her place card. He sat with effortless stillness, sipping water from a crystal goblet like he'd done it 1,000 times. His posture wasn't nervous. It wasn't arrogant either. It was content. As if he knew he belonged there. As if he knew she'd be the one with the problem. Claire's spine straightened. Her heels clicked louder than usual as she approached. "I didn't realize we were seating event staff at table 1 now," she said, voice light and laced with sugar. The man looked up and nodded politely. "I was invited." Claire gave a thin smile. "Oh, I'm sure you were. I just didn't expect the dress code to bend this far." No reaction. He didn't flinch, didn't blush, didn't explain. He simply turned his attention back to the program on the table, his fingers trailing across the names of keynote speakers. Claire slid into her seat beside him, her pearl cape falling perfectly around her shoulders. She took a slow sip of champagne. "You know," she said louder, eyes darting across the table, "it used to mean something to sit here. Tradition, contribution, elegance. Now, I suppose it just means you RSVP'd quickly." This time he looked at her not with offense or irritation, but calm. "Maybe it still means something," he said quietly. "Just not to the same people," Claire blinked. Not because of what he said, but because of how unbothered he was when he said it. She adjusted her bracelet and leaned in, just enough to be heard by the whole table. "After all," she said sweetly, "this isn't exactly quiz night at a pub in Shoreditch." Still nothing. The silence from him wasn't weak. It was deliberate. And for the first time that evening, Claire Whitmore felt something she hadn't in years. Uneasy. From across the table, a laugh escaped Baron Edgerton, one of Claire's usual allies. He leaned in with his wine, glancing between them. "Friend of yours, Claire?" he asked with a smirk. "Oh no," she replied brightly. "But perhaps he's part of the entertainment. A little social experiment. You know how these modern galas try to spice things up." The Baron chuckled, but his eyes didn't quite meet hers. The woman beside him looked down at her plate. Someone to Claire's right took a sudden interest in their napkin. The ripple was subtle, but she noticed. Something wasn't landing the way it usually did. She reached for her clutch and retrieved her phone, pretending to scroll through messages, but her thoughts weren't on emails or donation pledges. They were stuck on the man beside her, his silence, his stillness, his refusal to play by the rules she'd spent years mastering. He didn't have to say anything to make people curious. He didn't try to impress. He didn't beg to be seen. He simply existed, and the room bent ever so slightly in his direction. The orchestra shifted into a waltz. Waiters began placing the first course on the tables, an artful arrangement of seared scallops and microgreens. The man picked up his fork and ate slowly, calmly, like he had all the time in the world. Claire took one bite and set her fork down sharply. She turned to Lord Densmore across the table, voice sweet as icing. "Isn't it fascinating," she said, "how some people confuse minimal effort for authenticity? You can walk in wearing sneakers these days and still be hailed as genuine." Densmore raised his eyebrows, then gave a cautious smile. "Well," he said, "perhaps it's the era of strategic humility." Claire's smile sharpened. "Yes, I do love a good strategy. Though I always thought humility came with a touch of manners." Still, no response from the man beside her. She turned slightly toward him. "Would you like me to ask the kitchen if they have a spare jacket?" Her voice was soft, edged in velvet. Something a bit more appropriate. The man didn't even glance up. He took another sip of water, utterly undisturbed. The restraint was maddening. Across the room, she saw heads begin to turn, not to look at her, but at him. Subtle glances, sideways whispers. A camera flash flickered near the back, pointed not at the chandelier, but at their table. Claire's hand tightened slightly around the stem of her glass. This wasn't going according to script. He wasn't supposed to be still standing. He wasn't supposed to sit at her table, unmoved, unashamed, and unafraid. And somewhere, beneath the quiet hum of the string quartet, a shift had already begun. The stage was set. But not for the act Clare Whitmore thought she was starring in. London's sky had dimmed to a velvet blue by the time the first wave of guests began arriving at the Royal Horizon Gala. The event, hosted each year by Prince William himself, was more than a fundraiser. It was a declaration, a silent, glittering affirmation of who still held power, who had gained favor, and who was quickly being forgotten. Invitations were dispatched weeks in advance, sealed with gold wax, delivered by personal courier. To receive one was rare, to decline one was political suicide. Outside the venue, the Royal Albion Ballroom stood like a palace from another age. A curved staircase wrapped around the grand entryway, guarded by lanterns that flickered like ancient fire. Valets stood at perfect attention as a parade of Bentleys and Aston Martins slid to a stop, releasing guests dressed in custom couture and $1,000 scents. A Rolls-Royce pulled up, and a duchess stepped out, her emerald necklace reflecting off the stone tiles like shards of glass. Each arrival was a show, each footstep part of a choreographed ritual of prestige. Inside, it was even more surreal. Crystal chandeliers hung from domed ceilings painted with murals of Greek gods and Renaissance gardens. Marble staircases spiraled in both directions, framed by columns etched in gold leaf. The orchestra, tucked neatly to one side of the main ballroom, played soft Vivaldi, its notes floating through the air like perfume. At the center of the reception hall stood a towering champagne fountain, each arc of golden liquid catching the chandelier light and scattering it across the velvet-lined walls. The guest list was a carefully curated mosaic of politicians, philanthropists, cultural icons, and generational wealth. There were oil tycoons from the Middle East, tech billionaires from San Francisco, aging royals, young socialites. Their conversations blended into a hum of polished accents and veiled agendas. Deals were hinted at over foie gras. Rivalries were nodded at across champagne, flutes. Even the way someone folded their evening gloves could speak volumes. This was not a night for the modest. It was a night for the remembered. And no one knew that better than Clare Whitmore. Her entrance was calculated to the second. Her chauffeur Jaguar pulled to the front of the valet line just as the press reached peak activity. A timed flurry of camera shutters greeted her as she emerged. Her silver gown, designed in Paris and flown in the night before, shimmered like frost under spotlights. A floor-length cape stitched with mother-of-pearl beads drifted behind her like falling snow. Her heels were Italian, her diamonds vintage, and her smile as fixed as any statue in a gallery. She paused at the top of the steps, letting the flashes capture her from every angle. Even her blink was deliberate. She was not just part of the gala, she was its headline. As Clare descended the marble steps, her posture held a grace she had perfected over decades of high society events. Her head remained high, her hands softly at her sides, letting the train of her gown ripple behind her like a royal veil. She gave a slight nod to the event photographer stationed by the pillars and flashed the kind of smile that said she remembered his name, though she didn't. Everything was part of the performance. Guests near the entry parted instinctively. A few extended gloved hands in greeting. A fashion editor whispered her name to someone's ear. And yet, none of it surprised Clare. It was the order of things. She was the woman people watched for cues. Her approval could launch a gallery. Her silence could bankrupt it. But as she neared the velvet rope marking the guest check-in area, her rhythm was interrupted. There, standing just in front of the welcome desk beneath the high archway, was a man who looked like he had taken a wrong turn from the parking lot. A simple black t-shirt. Jeans clean but plain. Sneakers, faded at the edges, not even polished. He stood calmly, hands lightly folded, waiting for his turn, as if he didn't notice the tidal wave of silk and tuxedos passing around him. Clare's steps slowed, but only slightly. She took in every detail in one sweeping glance. No cufflinks, no boutonniere, not even a coat to hide the audacity of that outfit. He wasn't a staff member, he wasn't wearing the uniform. Nor did he hold a clipboard or a tray. He just stood there. Her gaze narrowed, confused. Then she noticed something even stranger. He wasn't trying to fit in. He wasn't avoiding eye contact or fidgeting nervously. In fact, he looked entirely at peace. His eyes scanned the registration desk the way one might observe clouds patiently, with no urgency. Clare turned sharply to the young staffer holding the digital guest list tablet. Her voice dropped to a controlled murmur, full of judgment disguised as concern. "Is there a separate line for deliveries?" she asked. The girl blinked. "Excuse me?" Clare nodded toward the man. "He appears to be lost." Before the staffer could answer, the man stepped forward. He held out a simple white card. The scanner beeped once, then again. "Priority guest," the digital voice confirmed. Claire's smile didn't break, but it grew tighter. The staffer smiled. "Welcome, Mr. Reeves." The man nodded and stepped beyond the velvet rope, vanishing into the ballroom with the same quiet grace that made no sound yet stirred the entire atmosphere. Claire remained still for a breath too long. Then she exhaled, checked her reflection in the nearest mirror, and walked forward faster than before. She wasn't used to being ignored. She wasn't used to being second. The main ballroom opened before Claire like a stage ready for its leading actress. Spotlights danced across the marble floor, catching on every facet of every jewel, every polished shoe, every satin sleeve. Waiters moved in fluid lines between tables with flutes of veuve clicquot and delicate hors d'oeuvres, balanced like art on silver trays. The air carried the scent of roses and wealth, subtle but unmistakable. Claire didn't look around for approval. She didn't have to. She knew the eyes would find her. They always did. As she moved through the crowd, old acquaintances greeted her with nods and whispered praise for her gown. A duchess she hadn't spoken to in months leaned in for a cheek kiss. A tech founder whose startup she'd once funded made a point of stepping into her path to say hello. Claire moved among them with the elegance of a queen among courtiers. Every gesture calculated, every smile efficient. Yet behind her poise, something nagged at the edges of her thoughts. That man, Reeves, they had called him Mr. Reeves. She hadn't recognized him, not from press, not from society events, not even from business circuits, and she knew almost everyone, or rather, everyone who mattered. The name played over in her mind as she passed the tall double doors into the heart of the ballroom, where the orchestra swelled into a Strauss waltz. There was something infuriating about the way he had looked so comfortable, so quiet, so completely unshaken by the spectacle around him. Claire's heels clicked louder on the tile than usual. At the far side of the ballroom, a soft chime rang, and the ushers began guiding guests to their assigned tables. She followed the crowd toward the elevated platform near the stage table 1, the crown jewel of the gala, where royalty, principal donors, and legacy partners were seated. The table was dressed in deep navy silk and trimmed with golden embroidery. Fresh white orchids stood tall at its center, their scent delicate but deliberate. Claire's name glimmered on the place card beside the largest crystal glass, but something was wrong. Someone was already seated next to it. It was him, the man in the black t-shirt. He sat with the same calm stillness as before, now holding a glass of water and glancing casually through the printed evening program. There was no tuxedo, no bow tie, no patent leather shoes. Just him. Just that same silence that didn't ask for space, but somehow took it. Claire stopped short. Her hand gripped the back of her chair, and for a brief second, just long enough for her to register the absurdity of it all, she felt as though the chandelier above had dimmed, just slightly, only over her. She smoothed her gown, forced a smile, and sat down. But something had shifted. And though the gala was just beginning, Claire Whitmore had already lost her footing. Claire didn't sit for long. Her spine was too straight, her pulse too fast, and the silence beside her, his silence, was unbearable. She couldn't understand it. Not the outfit, not the manner, not the calmness. It wasn't just that he didn't belong, it was that he didn't seem to care. As if none of this, the chandeliers, the curated guest list, the gleaming silverware, had any power over him. That made her skin crawl. So she stood up again. She crossed the ballroom floor with graceful urgency, her cape fluttering behind her like the wing of some startled bird. Past the orchid arrangements, past murmured conversations, back toward the entry arch, where a cluster of staffers stood politely at attention, each one holding a tablet or greeting late arrivals with flawless smiles. Claire zeroed in on the woman who had scanned his card. "You," Claire said gently. Her tone dipped in cordial sweetness, the kind that made people listen even when they didn't want to. The staffer blinked and smiled. "Yes, ma'am?" Claire leaned in, lowering her voice just enough to make it feel conspiratorial. That man you checked in earlier? Dark jeans, sneakers, no jacket? He's seated at the royal table? Are you absolutely certain there wasn't a mistake?" The young woman hesitated. His invitation scanned as a priority guest. It came with direct clearance from the royal liaison's office. Claire's jaw didn't move, but something in her cheek twitched. Direct clearance? "Yes, ma'am. He's on the formal list." Claire paused. Then she smiled. A cold, polite practice smile. "Of course. Thank you, darling. I was just surprised. That's all." She turned away slowly, every step back toward the ballroom heavier than the last. But before she reached the grand archway again, she heard one of the male staffers behind her whisper, just barely audible, "Was that Claire Whitmore?" "Yes," the young woman replied quietly. "I think she thought Mr. Reeves was staff." Claire's heel stopped mid-stride. She didn't turn, she didn't speak, but her throat tightened and the heat rose beneath her collarbone. She walked on. As she re-entered the ballroom, the atmosphere shifted around her, not enough for anyone to name it out loud, but just enough for the energy to change. She felt it in the eyes that followed her. In the half-smiles offered by guests she knew well. They'd heard something. Not the words, but the tone. A change in temperature. A breeze of doubt. She didn't like that. Claire returned to the table. He was still there, seated comfortably, sipping from the same glass of water as before. No name tag, no visible affiliation. Just a man in plain black, surrounded by silver and silk. She took her seat again with the stiffness of someone trying not to show they had tripped. The orchestra swelled, and across the table, someone leaned toward her. "Interesting guest list this year," they said. Claire smiled, but her hands tightened around the edge of her napkin. She didn't look at him right away. She couldn't after the walk back, not after the murmurs at the entrance, not after realizing people were already asking questions. Her entire life was built on perception, and now sitting at the most prestigious table in the ballroom, she could feel it cracking at the edges. The tension wasn't just in her shoulders, it was in the air. The man beside her hadn't moved. He turned a page in the Gala program, then set it down neatly. He took a sip from his glass. Not hurried, not hesitant, just still. The kind of stillness that unsettled people who lived on noise. Claire folded her napkin into her lap and glanced around the table. Some guests were talking softly. A few were looking at their phones. But more than a few were stealing quiet glances toward Keanu. She forced herself to look at him now. "So," she said lightly, "I suppose they're relaxing the dress code entirely these days." He looked over, polite, but unreadable. "I wasn't aware there was a requirement," he said. Claire offered a small laugh. "Well, perhaps not written, but surely implied. Most of us try to honor the spirit of the evening." "I believe I am," he replied. That quiet answer struck her harder than anything he could have said with force. There was no irony, no irritation, just calm. She reached for her champagne flute, fingers resting elegantly on the stem. "I suppose next year we'll all be in sandals and denim," she said to no one in particular. The banker to her left chuckled politely. But there was a pause, that fraction of a beat too long before people joined in. The kind of pause that only happens when a joke doesn't quite land. Keanu said nothing. He didn't need to. Claire's eyes flicked back to the entrance of the ballroom. She spotted one of the aides walking past, clipboard in hand. She raised 2 fingers and caught his attention with a smile. "Would you be a dear?" she said softly when he approached. "I think there may have been a slight mix-up in the seating chart. This gentleman's card didn't have a name." "I'd hate for there to be confusion." The aide gave a stiff smile. "Yes, ma'am. Let me double-check." He disappeared quickly. Claire returned to her wine, letting her expression remain neutral, but her thoughts moved like fire. It wasn't about the clothes anymore. It wasn't even about the seating. It was the way no one seemed to question him, the way he didn't flinch under scrutiny, as if he knew something she didn't. She hated that. She'd spent her entire career ensuring there were no surprises at events like this. And now a man with no name tag and no visible pedigree had walked into her domain like it belonged to him. She wasn't going to let that stand. The aide returned just as the appetizer plates were being cleared. He leaned in behind Claire's chair and handed her a folded slip of paper. She opened it carefully beneath the table, shielding it from view with her clutch. Seated correctly, guest of the royal liaison. Clearance confirmed. That was all it said. No explanation, no apology, no correction to soothe her ego. Just confirmation that he belonged there, and by extension, that she had been wrong. Claire folded the paper slowly, deliberately, as if it were made of glass. Then she slipped it into her clutch and took another sip of champagne, this one slower than the last. Her lips remained in a practiced smile, but her knuckles whitened around the stem of her glass. He didn't react. Had he seen the note? Heard the whisper? Or was he simply immune to her presence altogether? She turned slightly toward him. "You know," she said, voice lower now, "there's a rhythm to these evenings, a certain decorum. One would hope even new guests would understand that." He didn't even look at her, just set down his glass gently and replied in a quiet tone, "Maybe the rhythm needs changing." Claire stared at him. That was it. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't meet her challenge with one of his own. He just offered a quiet sentence and turned back to the stage, where a string quartet had begun to play something elegant and haunting. Claire forced a laugh. "Well," she said a bit louder, "perhaps we're all being tested tonight. See how flexible the old guard can be." Polite chuckles followed, though they were thinner now, less certain. Across the table, someone adjusted their seat. Another tapped distractedly at their phone. The energy at table 1 had shifted. Not dramatically, not loudly, but like a painting slightly askew, it was enough to bother people, even if they couldn't say why. And Claire could feel it. She wasn't just trying to assert herself now, she was trying to recover ground. The man beside her, Keanu Reeves, apparently hadn't raised his voice, hadn't made a scene, hadn't defended himself with so much as a sentence, longer than 7 words. And somehow, he was still winning. She straightened her posture and looked around the ballroom. The night was still young. There were speeches to be made, bids to be placed, names to be dropped. She would find a way to turn this back in her favor. She always did. But deep in her stomach, something unfamiliar was taking root. She couldn't name it yet, but it felt like doubt, and she hadn't tasted that in years. Claire adjusted the napkin in her lap for the second time, a gesture meant to appear casual but loaded with calculation. Her pearl bracelet slipped slightly down her wrist as she reached for her wine, her every movement an extension of practiced poise. But the man beside her remained a stone in the river, unmoving, unbothered, unrefined. She glanced again at his clothes, the t-shirt still without a wrinkle, the jeans dark and unfashionably simple. His shoes were nearly silent, though she'd heard the faintest squeak when he'd crossed his legs earlier. It irritated her. The subtle sound, the stillness of him. It all felt deliberate, like an act of defiance wrapped in silence. "I must say," Claire murmured, just loud enough for the guests to her left to hear, "I didn't realize minimalism had made such a return. Perhaps I've been overdressing all these years." The woman beside her gave a nervous chuckle. The man across the table didn't respond at all. "I mean, don't get me wrong," Claire added, swirling the wine in her glass. "There's something brave about showing up as you are. It's refreshing." Keanu lifted his eyes briefly, just enough to acknowledge the air around her voice, then returned his gaze to the centerpiece. The orchids didn't flinch either. The silence that followed was thick, not quite awkward, not quite hostile, but something between. Guests at the table exchanged tiny glances, unsure if they were meant to laugh or remain quiet. One older gentleman cleared his throat and reached for a bread roll. Claire leaned in slightly toward the man across from her. Lord Albridge, an aging aristocrat with a fondness for scandal and soft cheese. "I've always said the Royal Gala should be a celebration of legacy, don't you think?" she said sweetly. "A reflection of where we come from and where we aspire to go." Albridge nodded, though his eyes darted toward Keanu with the flicker of a question he didn't voice. "Which makes the seating chart quite the puzzle this year," Claire continued, lifting her glass with a graceful wrist. "Though I suppose mystery guests do keep things interesting." Still, Keanu said nothing. Claire turned slightly toward him now, forcing the proximity. "Do forgive me," she said, lips curved into a smile just sharp enough to cut. "But I don't believe I caught your name." He looked at her now, calm and unwavering. "Keanu." She held the silence, waiting for him to continue. He didn't. Just Keanu. No last name, no title, no job description. And in that pause, he unsettled her again. Because once more, he wasn't playing the game. Claire blinked, quickly masking her surprise behind a tight smile. One name. No elaboration. Not even the courtesy of clarifying who he was or why he was seated beside her at the most exclusive table in the country. That kind of restraint wasn't just rude in her world, it was power. And that made it dangerous. "Well, Keanu," she said, drawing out the name like it was unfamiliar. "I suppose mystery is part of your charm." He didn't reply, just reached calmly for his glass of water again, fingers steady. Across the table, Lady Fenhurst offered a polite cough, an attempt to shift the mood. "Lovely program this year, isn't it?" she said to no one in particular. "The Foundation's reach has grown tremendously." "Yes," Claire replied, seizing the opportunity to steer the conversation back into her comfort zone. "Of course, we're quite proud of the expansion. The Kenya initiative alone has quadrupled in reach since last year." "Impressive," murmured someone. Keanu nodded slightly. "That's good to hear." Claire turned toward him again. "Are you familiar with the Foundation's work?" His response was measured. "A bit." "Just a bit?" she asked, eyebrows raised. "You must be new to this world." He didn't rise to the bait. "I prefer to observe first," he said. Claire laughed, the sound light and too rehearsed. "Ah, the strong and silent type. We haven't had one of those at table one in quite some time." There was a murmur of laughter, shallow and unsure. No one wanted to offend Claire, but no one wanted to offend the unknown man either. It was the kind of social limbo that made powerful people deeply uncomfortable. Claire turned her gaze outward, scanning the table as if looking for support. But the guests' eyes were down, their expressions vague. A few picked at their plates, others reached for wine refills. The usual quiet confidence of the elite had become something else hesitant, cautious, and Claire hated it. She leaned in again, her voice lower now. "You know, people pay millions for seats at this table. They wait years to be included. But you just walked in." Keanu didn't move. "Tell me," she continued, smile fixed. "Who do you know?" He met her eyes, unflinching. "Does it matter?" The table went still. Even the music from the orchestra seemed to soften for a moment, as though the room itself were listening. Claire sat back in her chair, folding her hands neatly over her lap. Her face remained pleasant, but her heartbeat was uneven. He was doing nothing, and yet he was winning. That silence of his, it wasn't passive, it was deliberate. And the more he said nothing, the more the room began to wonder why she was saying so much. Claire's fingertips pressed against the stem of her glass, a little too tightly now. Her jaw ached from the constant smiling. The man beside her had spoken fewer than a dozen words, and yet he had shifted the entire dynamic of the table. She could feel it in the way people glanced at him with growing curiosity, in how conversations drifted and then stalled every time his presence hovered just beneath the surface. She leaned toward Baron Langston on her right, lowering her voice just enough to make sure the words carried to those nearby. "I can't decide," she said with feigned amusement, "whether this is a very elaborate prank or simply a brilliant example of charity's inclusivity." Langston chuckled awkwardly. "Well, it's certainly different this year." Claire smiled. "Yes, well, I suppose every circus needs a wild card." Keanu continued cutting into his entree, entirely unfazed. He hadn't even glanced in her direction during the exchange. His indifference stung more than outrage would have. From across the table, Lady Fenhurst shifted in her seat and spoke quickly. "I heard Prince William will be addressing the room soon, likely before the auction begins." Claire jumped on the subject. "Of course, he's always been such a gracious host. This event wouldn't be what it is without his vision." Keanu nodded slightly. "He's earned a lot of respect." His voice was steady, warm and disarmingly genuine. Claire tilted her head. "You speak as though you know him." Keanu took a sip of water. A little. That was it. No elaboration. No name dropping. No need to impress. And that made people notice even more. Clare forced a laugh. Well, you certainly don't act like the rest of us do when royalty's involved. He looked at her calmly. I try not to act. The simplicity of the reply, its unpolished clarity, hung in the air longer than expected. Lord Albridge tapped the edge of his plate, offering a hasty chuckle. Yes. Well, authenticity is rare these days. There were polite nods, a few soft smiles. No one was looking at Clare now. Clare leaned back in her chair, adjusting her cape, eyes fixed on the chandelier above. Her mind was racing. This man, this quiet stranger in jeans, had walked into the most exclusive room in London and stripped her of the one thing she relied on most: control. Not through confrontation, not through name or title, just presence. And the more she tried to dominate the conversation, the more invisible she became. She looked around the table once more, taking silent note of every sideways glance, every pause and laughter, every guest who now tilted slightly toward him. Her reign at table 1 had always been unchallenged, until tonight. The fish course had just arrived, poached sea bass with lemon foam and truffle glaze, when Clare decided it was time to reclaim the table. She had lost ground, and she could feel it. The atmosphere around her had changed. Guests who once leaned in when she spoke were now looking elsewhere, stealing glances toward the man in the black shirt. That would not stand. She placed her fork down gently, her movements flawless, and turned slightly to Baron Langston again. This time, she didn't bother to lower her voice. You know, she said with a theatrical sigh, I almost wore something casual tonight. A sweater maybe. Jeans, if I felt bold. But I thought, no, Clare, don't upstage the servers. Langston gave a polite laugh, though it didn't reach his eyes. The woman next to him chuckled as well, though hers was shorter and more awkward. Across the table, a guest raised her eyebrows, but said nothing. Keanu didn't move. He continued eating, unhurried, as though the room weren't spinning in slow circles around him. Clare leaned forward, smiling brightly. Honestly, we should be celebrating. I think we're witnessing the evolution of Gala fashion. Next year, I'm bringing my gardening gloves. Someone laughed too loud. It was nervous, uncontrolled. Then silence again. Keanu lifted his napkin, dabbed his lips, and returned it to his lap. That was all. Clare pressed on. It's remarkable, really, she said to no one in particular, how far confidence can take you. Just walk into the most exclusive event in London, sit wherever you like, and wear whatever you pulled from the laundry pile. No response, not even a glance. The silence that followed was heavier than the laugh that preceded it. Someone coughed. Someone else shifted in their chair. A fork clinked a little too loudly on porcelain. Clare noticed all of it. She turned her head slightly toward Keanu now, not smiling anymore. I'm curious, she said, her tone sweet but tightened. Did you know this was a formal event? Or did you think it was a charity mixer at the pub? Keanu looked at her then, only for a moment. Calm, steady. I came for the cause, he said simply. And then he turned his attention to his plate again, as if she hadn't spoken at all. It was a quiet dismissal. Polite, restrained, but absolute. Clare felt it in her chest, like a door closing. She sat back in her chair. Someone at the table shifted the conversation abruptly. Something about travel plans to Monaco. But Clare heard the undertone in their voice, the way it lifted just slightly to escape the tension. They were moving on, not from the awkwardness, from her. Clare reached for her wine again, but this time her hand was slower. Not shaking, not yet, but not as precise as it had been earlier in the evening. She took a long sip, letting the chilled liquid dull the sting of being ignored. He hadn't fought back. That would have been easier to manage. He simply absorbed her comments, like stone absorbs rain, without changing, without reacting. It made her feel like she was arguing with a statue in the middle of a museum. Elegant, silent, immovable. She turned toward Lord Albridge, hoping for an easy target. Have you noticed? She began with forced levity. How these galas are starting to attract more performance art? Perhaps our guest is a living metaphor. Lord Albridge gave a soft smile, more out of habit than agreement. His eyes drifted down to his plate, and he gave a non-committal grunt. Lady Fenhurst, seated directly across, raised a single eyebrow. A metaphor for what, exactly? Clare tilted her head thoughtfully. Oh, you know, the rise of unfiltered authenticity. The kind of charm that says, I didn't try, but I still deserve to be here. There was a long pause. Then Lady Fenhurst replied, her voice mild but pointed. Or perhaps the kind that says, I don't need to prove anything. The comment landed like a drop of ink in a glass of water, subtle, but impossible to ignore. Clare held her smile. Of course, that's another interpretation. Keanu reached for his water again, still calm. He hadn't spoken in several minutes, yet the weight of his presence was undeniable. It pressed against the table like a shadow that didn't require light. Clare tried once more. Tell me, Keanu, she said brightly, how did you hear about the foundation? Was it through a friend, or just an open invite on social media? He didn't answer right away. He finished chewing, wiped his mouth, and set his fork down gently. A friend, he said. Just that. No name, no detail, nothing to grab onto. Clare nodded. A mysterious friend, I imagine. He didn't reply. Someone at the far end of the table laughed softly at another conversation. It wasn't about her. It wasn't even near her. That irritated her more than she could admit. She had built her identity on being the center of the room, the one who lit the match, who set the tone, who carried the narrative from start to finish. But now, she felt like a prop in someone else's story, a fading background character. Keanu hadn't undermined her with a single insult. He hadn't raised his voice or defended his seat. But somehow, the table no longer belonged to her. It belonged to the man in the t-shirt, and she didn't know how to take it back. Clare leaned back in her chair, the tension in her spine masked by flawless posture. She smiled, but the edges of it were brittle now, almost sharp. Her gaze scanned the table like a radar, trying to find a signal, some flicker of allegiance, some anchor to her fading control. Baron Langston, who had once laughed at her every comment, was now speaking quietly with the woman beside him, their heads tilted close. Lady Fenhurst was dabbing the corner of her lips, her eyes casually drifting toward Keanu every few minutes. Even Lord Albridge had grown unusually quiet. He was chewing, slowly, avoiding everyone's gaze. Clare inhaled, held it, then let it out slowly. She turned to Keanu again, this time with the calculated warmth of a hostess trying to rescue a dinner party. I must say, she began, you're handling this attention quite gracefully. Most newcomers are a bit overwhelmed at first. Keanu looked at her. Should I be? She blinked. Oh, no, not at all. It's just unusual, that's all. He tilted his head, expression still unreadable. For someone to be quiet? Clare chuckled. No, for someone to be this, composed. Another pause, another silence. She felt like she was trying to wrap her fingers around fog. It's been a long evening, he said, eyes returning to his plate. Clare opened her mouth, then closed it again. Her next line, whatever it was, never formed. Because at that moment, she noticed something that startled her. People at the surrounding tables were watching, not openly, not boldly, but in glances, side looks, quiet turns of the head. It wasn't just table 1 that had felt the shift. It was the room. She saw a woman across the aisle whisper something to her companion. A man 3 tables down leaned back in his chair, trying to get a better view. A photographer, stationed near the dance floor, angled his lens, not at the chandelier or the royals, but at Keanu and Clare. That was when it hit her. This wasn't just a minor moment anymore. It had become theater, and she was no longer the one writing the script. Her voice, once the most trusted tool in any room, now felt too loud, too pointed, too desperate. Keanu's silence had exposed something far worse than contradiction. It had exposed her need. Her need to be seen, to be right, to be in control. She reached for her clutch, pretending to check a message. The screen was blank. It didn't matter. Anything to avoid sitting still in that chair, while the invisible current of the room shifted in favor of a man who hadn't asked for anything. And that was the cruelest irony of all. The more she tried to reclaim the spotlight, the further away it drifted. The lights dimmed slightly, signaling a transition in the evening. The orchestra quieted, the final note of a violin fading into silence. All eyes turned toward the stage, where a gold-trimmed podium stood beneath a cascade of orchids and soft spotlight. The host of the evening stepped forward, a tall, silver-haired man in a navy tuxedo, holding a slender microphone in one hand and a leather-bound catalog in the other. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "thank you for joining us for the annual Royal Horizon auction. Tonight's offerings are truly one of a kind, donated by collectors, estates, and institutions around the world." Polite applause followed. Clare straightened in her chair. This was the part of the night she knew best. The ritual of bidding, the dance of numbers, the performance of generosity wrapped in prestige. It was where reputations were sharpened and cemented. One could donate in silence, but bidding in public sent a message she was ready to deliver. The host continued, listing the first item, a signed first edition of Pride and Prejudice, preserved in a glass case, its pages edged in gold. Opening bid, £10,000. A paddle raised 2 tables over, then another near the back. Clare didn't move. She wasn't here to win every item. She was here to time her moment perfectly. The bids climbed to $25,000 before closing. The gavel struck once, sharp and final. A low hum of conversation followed, then quieted as the next item was revealed, an 18th century oil painting from a private French collection, rarely seen outside its original chateau. The starting bid was $75,000. Clare perked up. This was the one. She had already seen it in the catalog earlier that week. Moody, dramatic, valuable. She'd made a note of it, even told a journalist it was her favorite piece of the evening. This would be her moment to reclaim the room. A decisive bid, a graceful win. $75,000, the auctioneer called. Clare raised her paddle without hesitation. The room acknowledged her gesture. Lord Albridge glanced her way with a nod of approval. Lady Fenhurst murmured something to the woman beside her. Yes, this was the rhythm she knew. $80,000, came a voice from another table. $90, Clare said softly, lifting her paddle again. The auctioneer smiled. $90,000. Thank you, table 1. Then, something happened. Out of the corner of her eye, she saw movement. Keanu, still seated beside her, still dressed like he'd wandered in from the street, lifted his paddle. $100,000, the auctioneer called. Clare's head turned before she could stop herself. Keanu sat exactly as he had all evening, still, calm, focused. He said nothing, but his paddle was steady in his hand. And suddenly, the room wasn't watching the stage anymore. It was watching table 1. Clare froze, her hand still resting near her paddle. She felt the shift immediately. The silence around the table had changed, not empty, expectant. A few gasps fluttered near the edges of the ballroom. Not dramatic, but sharp enough to cut through the ambient hum of murmured conversation and clinking glasses. Baron Langston leaned forward slightly, his brow raised. Lady Fenhurst turned toward Keanu, eyes narrowing in open curiosity. Even Lord Albridge tilted his head, as though he'd misheard. Keanu didn't flinch. He didn't look around to see who was watching. He didn't offer a smirk, didn't acknowledge the dozens of eyes now fixed on him. His hand returned to the table, paddle set gently beside his water glass. He went back to his plate as if nothing unusual had happened at all. Clare blinked. Once, twice, her fingers curled against the linen napkin in her lap. $100,000, the auctioneer repeated, his tone carrying a subtle note of surprise. Do I hear 110? Clare straightened. She couldn't let this pass. It wasn't just about the painting anymore. It was about presence, territory. She hadn't spent the last decade building her status, only to have it disrupted by a man who refused to dress for the occasion. She raised her paddle again. 110. More glances, more whispers. The shift was accelerating. 110 from table 1, the auctioneer confirmed. Do I hear 120? Silence for a moment. Then Keanu lifted his paddle again, just once. 120. Clare turned toward him, now fully facing him. She let out a soft laugh, loud enough for others to hear. "My, we are ambitious tonight." He didn't respond. She leaned back in her chair, wineglass in hand, and continued, her voice dipped in honey, laced with edges. "It's lovely to see new guests participate so eagerly. Though I do hope you've accounted for the buyer's premium. It's always such a shame when enthusiasm outpaces preparation." A chuckle came from somewhere to the right, but it was thin, nervous. Keanu didn't move, didn't speak. 120 going once, the auctioneer called. Clare waited. Going twice. She hesitated just a second too long. Sold. The gavel rang out. To table 1. Applause followed, light and scattered. Not the roaring kind, the polite kind, the kind that tried to mask surprise. Clare clapped once, then stopped. Keanu nodded toward the stage and offered a small smile. Not arrogant, not mocking, just kind. And that made it worse. He wasn't competing. He wasn't trying to win. He was simply being. And Clare, for all her experience, for all her wealth, for all her perfectly rehearsed lines, suddenly felt like a guest at her own table. The applause faded, replaced by an odd silence that lingered around table 1 like a question no one wanted to ask aloud. Clare took another sip of her wine, this time not for flavor, but to steady her thoughts. She kept her expression pleasant, composed, but her mind raced. He had just bid £120,000 publicly, effortlessly, and won. No flinch, no hesitation. No follow-up request to verify a bank transfer or consult an advisor. Just a paddle, a nod, and silence. Clare leaned in toward Baron Langston once more, lowering her voice to a whisper but making sure it was loud enough to carry. "I do hope they accept payments in monthly installments. Would be such a shame if we had to pass the hat around." Langston offered a tight chuckle. The woman beside him stared at her napkin. Keanu sat perfectly still. The auctioneer continued with the next item, a rare manuscript from a 14th century Italian monastery. Guests murmured. Paddles lifted around the room. But the tension at table 1 had thickened. Not because of the auction, because of what had just happened. Clare tried again. She tapped lightly on the rim of her wineglass with her ring. "If nothing else," she said in a tone meant to entertain, "he certainly raised the bar for dramatic entrances." Another forced laugh from someone. No one followed. Clare's eyes scanned the table. Lord Albridge was now speaking quietly with Lady Fenhurst, their voices low and private. A guest 2 seats down pulled out his phone and typed something quickly, casting a glance toward Keanu without being obvious. She could feel it happening, the unraveling. Not with a bang, not with humiliation, but with a slow, quiet retreat of attention. It wasn't just that people were curious about Keanu. It was that they no longer needed her to interpret the room for them. She wasn't the narrator anymore. She turned to Keanu one last time, voice even softer now. "Impressive," she said. "Really, though next time, perhaps let someone explain the unspoken etiquette." He looked at her, and for the first time that evening, he spoke not with calm, but with quiet precision. "I didn't break the etiquette," he said. "I just didn't follow the theater." She didn't answer. Couldn't. The words hung there, simple and devastating. Then he turned back to the stage, where the next round of bidding had begun. Clare sat motionless, her spine still straight, her expression still fixed. But inside, something shifted. Not anger, not outrage. Something far more dangerous to her carefully cultivated world. Doubt. And it came not from what he said, but from the realization that the room was no longer orbiting her voice. It had found a new center. The next item displayed on the screen above the stage was a hand-painted triptych from the Baroque period, an ornate, glimmering religious work from a cathedral in southern Spain, never before sold, and donated anonymously. The starting bid was £90,000. Clare leaned forward, seeing opportunity. This was her arena, her redemption. Something old, expensive, sacred. It fit her narrative heritage, elegance, history. And after the slight humiliation of the last round, this would be her return to dominance. The auctioneer announced the starting bid. 90,000. Clare raised her paddle immediately. Thank you, table 1. Do I hear 100,000? Before another paddle could rise, Keanu lifted his. 100,000 from table 1, the auctioneer confirmed again. Clare turned her head slowly. Well, she said, her voice sweet but crackling just beneath. Someone's feeling ambitious tonight. Keanu gave a small nod and looked forward again. Clare smiled, then looked around the table. I do admire that kind of spirit, she said loud enough for others to hear, even when it's, let's say, aspirational. A few guests chuckled, though it was the kind of laughter that ended too quickly. A waiter passing behind table 1 slowed slightly, clearly sensing tension but trained not to react. 110,000, Clare said, holding her paddle high. She didn't look at him this time. She didn't need to. The auctioneer didn't skip a beat. 120? A brief pause. Then Keanu's paddle rose again. 120,000. Thank you, sir. Clare tilted her head to the side and whispered toward Lord Albridge, just loud enough. Should we take up a collection? Poor man may not realize these are real numbers, not charity tokens. Albridge gave a stiff smile but didn't respond. His eyes flicked downward. 130? Asked the auctioneer. Clare raised her paddle again. 130,000. Across the ballroom, heads were beginning to turn. Not everyone was watching, but enough were. Guests who didn't know Clare personally were whispering now, trying to place the man beside her, the one who kept matching her stride for stride, without apology or explanation. 140? Came the call. Keanu didn't hesitate. His paddle lifted once again. The auctioneer clapped his hands softly. 140. Going once. Clare didn't move. The auctioneer's voice rang out again. Going twice. Clare turned her head slowly, wine in hand, her tone sharp beneath its silk. Do let me know if you'll need help with the deposit. I'm sure one of us can chip in. More nervous laughter around the table. Even the orchestra had gone quieter between sets. Keanu's face remained neutral. He did not respond. He didn't even look at her. He simply rested his paddle beside his water and folded his hands. Sold, said the auctioneer. To table 1. Clare set her glass down a little too hard. The sound was subtle, but sharp enough that a few heads turned. She smiled through it, but the smile was growing thinner by the second. Her carefully layered charm sweetness wrapped around superiority was starting to peel at the edges. He certainly enjoys the thrill, she said, gesturing vaguely toward Keanu as she spoke to no one in particular. It's always exciting until the invoice arrives. Someone across the table coughed. Someone else shifted their chair back slightly. Lord Albridge kept his gaze on the stage, jaw tight. Lady Fenhurst avoided Clare's eyes altogether. But Keanu remained exactly as he was still, steady, silent. The paddle rested next to his water. His face showed no sign of triumph, no arrogance. He wasn't celebrating the win. He wasn't even acknowledging it. And that, somehow, stung more. Clare turned back to her plate, stabbing a piece of salmon with more force than necessary. She didn't even realize she hadn't touched her appetizer. The flavors that once gave her comfort now tasted like cardboard. The auctioneer introduced the next item, a rare jeweled brooch from the Victorian era, worn once by Queen Alexandra herself. The provenance alone made it a symbol of royal elegance. Clare knew this piece well. She had seen it in the preview materials. It was tasteful, not gaudy, dignified, a signature item. She had been planning to bid on it since last month. This was supposed to be her moment of quiet regality. A win that would need no commentary, no jokes. The starting bid, £60,000. Without hesitation, Clare raised her paddle. 60. The auctioneer nodded. Thank you, table 1. Do I hear 70? Someone 2 tables away raised their paddle. 70. 80, he called. Clare again. 80. 90. Pause. Then Keanu raised his paddle. 90 from table 1, the auctioneer confirmed, looking directly toward him. Clare closed her eyes for half a second. She felt the heat crawl up her neck. The brooch wasn't even his style. It wasn't something someone like him would value. So why was he doing this? She turned toward him and smiled tightly. You do know it's a brooch, not a Bitcoin. Keanu turned his head and finally looked at her, not with defiance, but with a kind of slow patience, like he was waiting for her to finish digging her own hole. "I know what it is," he said softly. Then he turned away again. 100,000, Clare snapped, raising her paddle again, louder this time. The auctioneer hesitated, then nodded. 100 from table 1. Do I hear 110? A longer pause. Keanu raised his paddle again. 110. Clare's hands clenched beneath the table. Because once again, without needing the room, the crowd, or even her attention, he had taken something she thought she owned. Clare's hand hovered near her paddle, but she didn't lift it. Not yet. The air around the table had thinned, like it always did when a line had been crossed, but no one wanted to be the first to name it. Guests stared at their plates. The clink of silverware had stopped. A single camera flash blinked from across the room, trained directly on table 1. 110,000 going once, the auctioneer called. Clare could feel the eyes. They weren't admiring anymore. They weren't drawn to her gown or her posture or her pearls. They were watching her struggle. Not financially, no one would question her ability to pay, but socially, they were watching her lose control of something that had never slipped before. Going twice. Keanu didn't glance her way. His gaze stayed forward, fixed on the stage, as if her barbs meant nothing. And maybe to him, they didn't do that. That thought struck deep. He wasn't trying to outbid her. He wasn't trying to embarrass her. He wasn't trying to do anything at all. He just existed. And for a woman who had built an empire on carefully curated presence, that was unforgivable. Sold, the auctioneer declared. To table 1. A smattering of applause followed, polite, restrained, almost obligatory. Clare clapped, but only once. Then her hands returned to her lap. She could feel her pulse behind her eyes. She smiled again, but the muscles in her face resisted. Another prize for the minimalist, she said under her breath. No one responded. A waiter passed behind her, refilling water glasses. Someone nearby began whispering about a vacation home in Corsica, but the voices sounded distant now. Clare leaned toward Keanu once more, her tone soft and mocking. "Tell me, what exactly do you plan to do with a Victorian brooch?" Keanu didn't look at her. He reached for his water glass, took a sip, then replied without inflection. "I know someone who'll love it." That answer, so simple and unbothered, landed harder than she expected. Not a flex, not a boast, just a statement of quiet purpose. Clare said nothing. She couldn't. Around the table, people began speaking again, soft chatter, shifting plates, a return to motion. But something had changed. Not in the event, not in the auction, but in her. The power she'd always wielded through suggestion, through tone, through posture was slipping. And the man beside her hadn't taken it. He'd never asked for it. He'd simply made it irrelevant. She turned her gaze toward the next item projected on the screen, something about an Egyptian relic. But her thoughts were no longer in sync with the catalog. For the first time in decades, Clare Whitmore had been outmaneuvered. Not by wealth, not by title, by a man who simply refused to play her game. Clare dabbed her lips with her napkin, eyes steady on her plate, though she wasn't tasting a thing. The brooch, the paddle, the way Keanu's name had traveled like wildfire through the tables without ever being formally introduced. It all pulsed under her skin, hot and disorienting. She couldn't allow it to go on. This wasn't about ego anymore. This was about restoring order. Without turning fully, she caught the eye of a passing server and lifted one finger, signaling with grace. The young man leaned in. "Would you be so kind," Clare said softly, "as to ask the event coordinator to join me for just a moment? There may have been a logistical oversight." The server nodded and slipped away. Clare smiled as if nothing had been said, then took another sip of her wine. She turned to Lord Albridge, who had thankfully returned to buttering his roll with slow, measured concentration. "This table always attracts the surprises," she said, as if recounting an old memory. One year, they seated a bishop next to a hedge fund director and didn't realize it until the bishop gave a blessing over the caviar. Albridge gave a short, polite laugh, but he didn't look at her. She glanced sideways at Keanu. Still seated, still calm. He hadn't touched his phone all evening, hadn't checked his watch. His napkin sat perfectly folded in his lap. No distractions, no armor. That bothered her, because his presence still carried weight, and he wasn't even trying. A few minutes passed, and then a man, in a crisp tuxedo with a lanyard, stepped discreetly toward table 1. He carried a clipboard and a practiced smile, one Claire recognized as the default setting for people who were about to say no but wanted to say it gently. "Good evening, ma'am," he said softly, stepping just behind her chair. Claire turned with warmth so precise it could have been measured. "Darling, thank you for coming. I just wanted to double-check the seating arrangement. It seems this gentleman's card didn't have a name on it. I thought perhaps he was meant for another table. I wouldn't want a mix-up to reflect poorly on your team." The man hesitated, then flipped through his clipboard. "No problem at all," he said quickly. "Let me confirm." He scanned the list with his finger, paused, then nodded. "Actually, he's seated exactly where he's meant to be. Priority placement from the Royal Liaison's office. Full credentials, nothing amiss." Claire blinked once, then smiled. "Of course, I only asked because there was no visible name. You understand." The coordinator gave a small bow. "Completely." He turned and left. Claire picked up her fork and delicately cut into her next bite. Her face remained composed, but her chest was hot, her pulse rising beneath the silk neckline of her gown. Across the table, someone had stopped pretending to look away. A woman in blue was watching her directly, not rudely, but not with admiration either. And Claire realized people were starting to sense it. She could feel it in the silence. Not a hush of reverence, but of curiosity, of quiet judgment. The kind of silence that made people lean just slightly away, the kind that sharpened glances and dulled smiles. Claire reached for her wine glass again, though it was already nearly empty. She held it like a shield, turning the stem slowly between her fingers. Across the room, the auction carried on the voices of the auctioneer, rising and falling, paddles lifting, numbers being spoken like casual suggestions. But at table 1, things had gone still. It wasn't about the bidding anymore. It was about her. Or rather, it was about him, and the way she kept reacting to him. Claire placed the glass back on the table, precisely aligned with her dessert spoon. She adjusted her bracelet, smoothed the side of her gown, then turned toward Keanu again. "Quite the night," she said with a light laugh, as if the last hour hadn't happened. "I must say, you've certainly made an impression." Keanu didn't look up. That wasn't the goal. Claire tilted her head. "Well, it happened anyway." He met her gaze then. Not with arrogance, not with challenge, just clarity. "Maybe that says more about the room than it does about me." She didn't respond. She couldn't. Across the table, Lady Fenhurst glanced between the two of them, then reached for her clutch, whispering something to the woman beside her. A man from the Tech Foundation 3 seats away tapped his phone and angled it slightly to take a discreet photo of Keanu, not of her. The room wasn't just curious now. It was shifting. Subtly, undeniably, the spotlight was moving. Claire's shoulders stiffened. She smiled again, mechanically now. She leaned toward Baron Langston. "It's fascinating, isn't it? How someone can walk into a place like this without so much as a collar and be mistaken for royalty." Langston blinked. "I don't think anyone's mistaken anything." His voice was quiet, neutral, but it stung, because it confirmed what she already knew. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This wasn't temporary. It was a reversal. She looked down at her plate, barely touched. The fish had gone cold. The flowers in the centerpiece, once elegant and ethereal, now looked overstyled and suffocating. She had orchestrated this table, had arranged its placements, its timing, its look, and now it had slipped from her hands. Keanu didn't speak again. He didn't need to, because more and more eyes across the ballroom had begun to drift his way, not in amusement, not in gossip, but in quiet admiration. Even those who didn't know his name could sense it. Presence, stillness, a kind of grounded gravity that couldn't be bought or inherited. Claire looked down, adjusted her napkin again, and told herself it was nothing. Just one night. Just one man. But the pit in her stomach said otherwise. This wasn't the end of something. It was the beginning. The conversation around table 1 had shifted entirely. It was quieter now, punctuated only by the occasional polite exchange or a nervous laugh from someone trying too hard. But underneath the surface, Clare could feel the murmur building. The energy in the room had changed, not against her directly, but away from her, and that was somehow worse. She could feel eyes drifting toward her, not in curiosity, but in discomfort, not in admiration, but in silent judgment. There was a weight pressing against her chest, light at first, now growing heavier with every minute she remained seated beside the man no one could stop watching. A waiter approached the table carrying nothing in his hands but a folded piece of paper. He moved with practiced ease, no urgency in his steps, no signal of importance in his expression. He leaned down behind Clare's chair and spoke so softly only she could hear. "Message for you, ma'am." She turned her head slowly. "A message?" she asked. He nodded, then slid the folded note into her hand and disappeared as quickly as he had arrived. Clare looked down at the small piece of heavy cream-colored paper. No emblem, no name, just an elegant fold. Her fingers trembled as she opened it beneath the table. 5 words, printed, not handwritten. "Please stop. He's the owner." The blood drained from her face. Her ears rang. She read the words again, as if they might change the second time. Owner? Of what? She folded the note slowly, carefully, slipping it into her clutch without expression. Her hand remained there, fingers gripping the edge of the purse as if it might anchor her. Her mind spun. The owner? Was he a guest donor? Number no one had mentioned his name. Was he a sponsor? A last-minute inclusion? Or had she missed something even larger, something unthinkable? She turned her head slightly, just enough to look at him again. He hadn't moved. His hands rested on the edge of his plate. His expression was unchanged, serene, detached, steady. Did he know she had received the note? Did he know what it said? Or had he been aware the entire evening, aware that she had mocked him, insulted him, tried to humiliate him without ever realizing she was speaking down to the man who had made the entire event possible? Clare's breath caught in her throat. Owner. It could mean anything, or it could mean everything. The foundation, the auction house, the very gala itself. She looked around the table. No one else had received a note, but a few eyes were on her now, flicking away quickly when she met their gaze. She reached for her wine glass again. It was empty. A waiter passed with a fresh bottle, but she didn't signal him. Her hands were too tight, her chest too warm, her face frozen in a smile that no longer came naturally. The whispers hadn't started. Not loudly, not yet. But she could feel them forming, just beneath the surface. Waiting. Clare steadied herself with a sip of water, but the cool liquid did nothing to calm the rising heat of dread in her chest. She looked straight ahead, pretending to listen to the conversation between 2 guests across the table, though she heard none of it. Her mind was entirely consumed by the 5 words still echoing in her head. Please stop. He's the owner. Had it been a warning, a reprimand, or a mercy? She glanced at Keanu again. He was speaking with the woman on his right, gently nodding as she described the antique book she had just won in the auction. Clare could hear the softness in his voice, now clear, calm, but not showy. There was no arrogance, no need for attention. He was comfortable in stillness, which somehow made his presence even louder. And now that Clare was watching him more closely, she saw something she had missed before. The way other guests leaned in when he spoke. The way the servers lingered just slightly longer at his side, attentive without being prompted. The way the event coordinator had earlier deferred to him without hesitation. Clare had dismissed it all as coincidence, or perhaps assumed they were indulging some eccentric actor's presence. But now she saw it differently. Now she saw respect, deference, even caution. She pressed her napkin against her lips, stalling for time. Was she the only one who hadn't known? Had the other guests guessed? Had they been laughing at her behind those polite smiles, watching her try to belittle a man whose quiet authority outclassed everything she had tried to build in this room? She spotted Thomas Brandt at a nearby table, the head of one of the wealthiest philanthropic networks in the country. He had been oddly reserved all evening, saying little during Claire's grandstanding earlier. But now he was watching Keanu with sharp interest, nodding slowly as if things were falling into place. That subtle nod sent a chill down Claire's spine. More guests were noticing the shift now. Not saying anything directly, of course. These were people raised in the art of social concealment, but they didn't need to speak for her to feel it. The gazes, the silence, the subtle sidesteps in conversation, where once she would have been drawn in. She had worked years to master this world. The power plays, the veiled compliments, the dominance through charm and presence. But here, now, with one line on a note and a man who hadn't raised his voice once, the entire balance had tipped. She reached for her clutch again, just to feel the folded paper inside, to reassure herself she hadn't imagined it. Please stop. He's the owner. That single sentence had unraveled the script she had written for the night, and she couldn't go back and rewrite it. Claire sat frozen, smile still painted on her face, but her grip on the silverware trembled. Every laugh at the table now sounded suspicious. Every glance felt loaded. She had spent the entire evening trying to humiliate him, unaware he was the quiet force funding the very cause they were celebrating. Humiliation didn't come in words. It came in silence, in realization, and in the unshakable truth that the man she tried to diminish had already won, not through status, but through grace. Around her, the room buzzed, but inside Claire, a storm raged louder than any applause could hide. A hush fell across the ballroom as the lights dimmed to a gentle amber glow. The soft hum of conversation dissolved, replaced by the delicate rise of strings from the live orchestra. All eyes turned toward the grand staircase that curved elegantly above the floor. The chandelier above glistened like a crown of stars, refracting light into every corner of the room. Then, a murmur swept through the guests. Like a wave, he was here. Prince William appeared at the top of the staircase, dressed in a tailored black tuxedo, his posture regal yet warm. He began his descent with quiet confidence, each step measured and composed. The room erupted into a collective gasp, followed by a standing ovation. Dozens of guests rose to their feet in unison, applauding and turning to one another with excited whispers. Phones were discreetly lifted, flashes flickering like fireflies, though the staff gently reminded guests of the no photos rule. Claire was the first among the main table to stand. She adjusted her gown and swept her hair behind one ear, smiling wide as if she'd just been reunited with an old friend. Her back straightened, and she pressed her hands together, clearly anticipating some moment of shared recognition. She whispered to the woman seated beside her, "This is it." It wasn't clear what she meant by that, but in Claire's mind, this was her cue to reclaim the spotlight. As Prince William reached the base of the staircase, 2 royal security guards flanked him subtly, keeping a respectful distance while scanning the crowd. A gala organizer stepped forward to hand the prince a silver microphone. The music softened, and the applause faded to an expectant silence. Prince William smiled warmly as he looked out at the distinguished crowd. "Good evening," he began, his voice smooth and measured. "It's an honor to be here tonight among so many generous hearts, gathered for a cause that means so much to this nation's future. The funds raised this evening will go far beyond this room. They will restore homes, they will build schools, they will spark hope." Claire listened intently, nodding with perfect posture and a strategically poised smile, as if each word were somehow a personal thank you to her. William continued, "I want to thank every donor, every supporter, and every volunteer who made tonight possible. It's your presence, not just your contributions, that uplift this mission." There was a pause, the kind of pause that hung in the air like something important was coming next. Prince William glanced down at a small card in his hand, then folded it and placed it into his jacket. "But tonight," he said, scanning the crowd, "there's one guest in particular whose presence and generosity went unnoticed by many, but whose impact was felt by all." A ripple moved through the audience. Guests turned to one another with curious expressions. Claire blinked. Her lips parted just slightly. Her eyes widened. She placed one hand gently on her chest. She was certain he meant her. Clare subtly turned her body toward the center aisle, adjusting her posture so the stage lights would catch her best angle. A soft, practiced smile played on her lips as she readied herself for the nod, the wave, the acknowledgement she believed she had earned. Prince William took a breath. "This guest didn't arrive with a fanfare," he said, his gaze drifting across the audience. He didn't announce his generosity. He didn't ask to be seated near royalty or positioned in front of the cameras. He came quietly, humbly, and yet he made tonight possible in more ways than one. A stir passed through the room. Clare's smile flickered, just barely. Her eyes darted to Keanu for a fraction of a second, then quickly back to William. It was a ridiculous notion. It had to be her. She'd planned months in advance. She'd personally recruited high-tier donors. She was photographed with dignitaries, quoted in interviews. Surely, the prince was simply building suspense before naming her. William offered a small smile. "I'm told he slipped in through a side entrance, preferred to sit in the back row of the early reception, and didn't want his name listed among the top sponsors." Clare's jaw tensed. People began to turn. Not toward her, but away from her. They were looking across the room, toward the far end of the main table where Keanu sat, calm and composed, quietly folding his napkin and placing it beside his empty plate. William continued, "He's been involved with our humanitarian partner foundation for years, quietly funding new roofs, clean water systems, mobile libraries. He's done more with silence than many have done with headlines." Now the heads weren't just turning, they were nodding. Clare's smile faltered completely. She couldn't stop herself from glancing toward Keanu again. He hadn't moved. He wasn't smiling. He wasn't even making eye contact with the prince. And yet, there was something about the stillness in him, a kind of gravity that had just shifted the entire atmosphere. Prince William looked directly toward Keanu's side of the table. "He's here tonight, and I hope he'll forgive me for calling him out. But I think this room deserves to know the kind of man who walks among them. Mr. Keanu Reeves." A beat of silence. Then a swell of applause. Not scattered or uncertain, full, rising, genuine. Guests stood again, this time with deeper meaning. Some clapped with both hands raised. Others simply looked toward Keanu with new eyes. Their expression softened, their admiration quiet but unmistakable. Keanu rose, but only halfway. He offered a simple nod to the prince, then sat back down, eyes downcast. No speech, no bow, no effort to take the moment. Clare remained seated. Her hands froze mid-clap. She looked around and found no one watching her. The spotlight, for the first time all evening, had landed somewhere else, and it wasn't going to move back. Clare's throat tightened. She reached for her champagne, but even the glass felt heavy now. Around her, the murmurs were no longer about gowns or gossip. They were about him, Keanu Reeves, the man she tried to diminish, and now the man the future king had just honored. The ballroom, already shimmering under crystal chandeliers, now glowed with something else: anticipation. Prince William stood at the podium, his voice calm but resonant, carrying the weight of something greater than a routine thank you. He smiled warmly at the guests, eyes scanning the room. "Tonight," he said, "we celebrate more than elegant gowns and generous donations. We celebrate the quiet power of character, humility, and vision." The audience leaned in. Many of you know the Royal Horizon Foundation as a centuries-old institution. But what you may not know is that tonight marks a new chapter, one that honors not just tradition, but transformation. He paused just long enough for hearts to quicken. "I would like to take this moment," he continued, "to recognize someone who has not only contributed enormously to tonight's event, but has also joined hands with our foundation in a way that will shape its future." There were hushed breaths, glasses lowered mid-sip. Clare's fingers clutched her clutch tighter. Prince William looked toward the main table. "Mr. Keanu Reeves, would you please stand?" A collective gasp echoed across the ballroom. Keanu, sitting quietly beside Clare, rose slowly. He gave a gentle nod to William, his expression composed but gracious. Cameras lifted discreetly. Some guests clapped instinctively. Others simply stared, mouths slightly parted. Clare didn't move. Her shoulders were tense, lips tight, but her eyes betrayed everything. Prince William's voice rang out again. "It is my great pleasure to announce that Mr. Reeves is the new co-owner of the Royal Horizon Foundation. His generous contributions, matched only by his humility, have already begun to fund schools in rural America, hospitals in post-crisis zones, and disaster relief where governments have failed to act swiftly." The room broke into stunned applause. Guests stood. Others murmured to one another, disbelief and admiration blending in their eyes. For many, it was the first time they'd seen Keanu up close. Now, they were witnessing something historic. Keanu offered a modest wave, then turned to Prince William. The two men met at the center of the room, shaking hands firmly. William leaned in and whispered something, which made Keanu smile. Clare sat completely still, her world unraveling silently behind her eyes. Every comment she had made, every dig, every smirk now echoed back at her louder than any applause. As the applause swelled around her, Clare stared straight ahead, trying to maintain the poise she'd perfected for years. But the whispers were impossible to ignore now. They weren't about her anymore. They were about him. People she once charmed now craned their necks to catch a better look at Keanu. The same man she'd mocked minutes ago. The same man she'd offered to help pay for an auction item. The man she assumed didn't belong. Across the room, a countess leaned toward her husband, eyes wide with surprise. "That's the actor, isn't it? But why didn't anyone say he was behind all this?" Another whispered, "He's been funding children's hospitals in secret? My God." Clare tried to humiliate him. Clare shifted in her seat, a tight smile stretching her lips. But inside, her heart pounded so loud it nearly drowned out the orchestra now playing in the background. She reached for her champagne glass again, but her hand trembled. She quickly placed it back down. Keanu remained calm, still standing, still gracious. He didn't bask in the attention. He simply accepted it with quiet dignity. Even as cameras snapped and guests applauded, he kept his eyes on William, not the crowd. He wasn't here for glory. That made it worse for Clare. Prince William turned to address the audience again. "What moved us most wasn't just Mr. Reeves's extraordinary donation," he said, "but the spirit in which it was given. He asked for no recognition, no plaque, no speech. He simply wanted to know how many lives could be changed if we worked together." Guests were visibly moved. Several dabbed their eyes. Others began clapping again, this time slower, more reverent. William added, "It's rare to meet someone whose fame is eclipsed by their kindness. Keanu, we are honored to have you as part of our mission." Keanu nodded politely, murmured something too soft to be heard, then returned to his seat. But this time, the seat beside Clare didn't feel like a shared table. It felt like a chasm. Clare turned her head slightly toward him, forcing another smile. "Quite the surprise," she whispered, her voice strained. Keanu looked at her, not with contempt or triumph, but something far worse, gentle indifference. He simply replied, "I just wanted to help." She had no response, no clever quip, no defense. Around them, the gala buzzed with renewed energy. Conversations sparked about new initiatives. Guests made mental notes to increase their donations, suddenly inspired by a man who never asked for praise. But at Clare's table, silence reigned. The queen bee had lost her crown. And the ballroom, once orbiting around her, now turned steadily toward a different kind of gravity, the kind built on humility, not hierarchy. As the orchestra resumed a light, celebratory melody, guests began drifting back to their tables with newfound reverence. Conversations echoed with admiration for Keanu. Words like humble, genuine, and unexpected floated from every corner of the ballroom. Clare sat perfectly still, her posture rigid, her expression unreadable. For the first time in years, no one was trying to get her attention. No one leaned in to flatter her or ask for introductions. The magnetic pull she had cultivated at every elite gathering had dissolved, replaced by the quiet gravity of the man beside her. Keanu said nothing more. He didn't gloat. He didn't remind her of her earlier insults. His silence, calm and composed, said enough. It was the kind of silence that humbled, that reset the balance of power without ever lifting a finger. Claire's chest tightened. She had miscalculated badly. All the charm, manipulation, and status games had failed her tonight. She had tried to humiliate someone who didn't play by those rules, and in doing so, she'd exposed her own vanity. Across the room, the spotlight no longer searched for her. It had settled elsewhere, on quiet kindness, on true generosity, on the man who never needed to raise his voice to be heard. The air shifted, subtle at first, but unmistakable. Claire sat stiffly, her fingers curling around the stem of her untouched wineglass. The applause for Keanu had faded, but the echoes of admiration lingered in every whisper, every sideways glance. Something had cracked, no, collapsed, and it wasn't just her public image. It was the entire illusion she had spent years constructing. Lord Ainsworth, once always at her side during these events, now stood a few feet away in conversation with a new group. She recognized several faces, bankers, trustees, Harrises, but not one of them looked her way. They leaned in toward Lord Ainsworth, occasionally nodding toward Keanu's table, not toward hers. Claire smoothed the fabric of her gown with deliberate grace, then rose from her seat. She smiled at a passing couple, both of whom gave her the kind of polite acknowledgement reserved for strangers, not the centerpiece of London's social elite. It hit her in small waves at first. Not rejection, but disinterest, and it was worse. She stepped forward, inserting herself into a nearby conversation where Lord Ainsworth was speaking to a young tech mogul and a duchess. Claire smiled and said, "I was just telling Prince Nicola about the Royal Horizons' upcoming art restoration project. Surely your foundation will play a role?" Lord Ainsworth glanced at her. It was brief. It was calculated. And then, like a needle to her ego, he turned back to the others without responding. The Duchess gave her a strained smile, the kind used when you didn't want to be rude but wished someone would go away. "I'm sure there are many opportunities," the tech mogul added vaguely, then quickly steered the conversation back to Keanu's contribution to educational programs in Southeast Asia. Claire stood there for a full breath, then another. No one invited her into the circle. The truth dawned not in one sudden moment, but in a slow, suffocating realization. She had built her influence on glitter and gossip, polished manners and power plays. But what Keanu had brought into the room, quiet integrity, global impact, humility, had swept away the old rules like a tide washing over footprints in sand. And no one was pretending anymore. She turned away, swallowing the acid of humiliation rising in her throat. Just 2 hours ago, she had been the one people followed from table to table. Now, she couldn't even finish a sentence before eyes drifted past her to someone else. They were watching Keanu, of course, watching how he held himself, how he didn't cling to attention, how it simply found him. She caught sight of a familiar friend near the dessert display, Caroline Moore, editor of the Royal Arts Review, once one of her closest allies in shaping high society narratives. Claire approached, hopeful. But Caroline was laughing with someone else, a guest from Los Angeles perhaps. Claire cleared her throat gently, standing just beside them. Caroline turned, gave a quick glance, and offered a half smile. Claire, lovely event. Then back to the conversation. No invitation to join, no mention of her dress. No curiosity about who she might be dining with next week. It wasn't just awkward, it was exile. Claire walked slowly toward the edge of the ballroom, her heels clicking on the marble like an unwanted echo. She passed a mirrored pillar and caught her reflection, still beautiful, still composed, but somehow dimmed. Something in her eyes betrayed the truth, the desperation, the knowing. A cluster of younger guests hovered near the donation display, where digital screens showed profiles of top contributors. Keanu's name glowed prominently beside a montage of school children, relief efforts, and medical tents. One girl gasped softly and said, "He's the one who built the mobile hospitals in Bangladesh. I had no idea." Claire lingered, hoping someone would notice her, mention her name, invite her to explain her involvement, which, in reality, had always been marginal at best. But no one asked. Their world had shifted. The gravitational pull no longer centered around her. She watched as another guest, someone she'd once considered a lower-tier invitee, leaned toward Keanu with genuine admiration. Not because he was a movie star, but because he was someone whose actions had substance. Clare had prided herself for years on knowing how to control the room, but she suddenly felt like a ghost among the living. She made her way back to her table, alone. The chair she had once claimed with confidence now felt foreign. Her napkin, untouched, lay folded beside the plate. Across the room, a waiter approached Keanu and bowed slightly, whispering something that made him smile humbly. The waiter nodded and left, as though delivering an update to someone important, someone respected. And then Clare noticed something else. People weren't just ignoring her, they were recalibrating. Her name was no longer currency in this room. She picked up her phone, hoping for a message, a text, a notification, a mention. There was nothing. Her inbox was still. No congratulatory messages. No photos from admiring guests. No headlines about her gown or arrival. Everything had gone quiet. And in that silence, Clare understood something deeper than embarrassment. It was insignificance. Not temporary, not circumstantial, permanent. She had built her throne on air, and tonight it had vanished. Across the ballroom, Keanu remained calm, still seated, speaking with a modest smile to those who approached. He wasn't performing. He wasn't basking in the moment. He was just present. That presence, quiet and rooted, was the very thing Clare had always lacked. She had relied on spectacle, timing, and leverage. But none of those tools worked anymore. The ones who used to seek her approval were now taking their cues from someone who didn't seek attention at all. Lord Ainsworth walked past her without a glance, not out of cruelty, but because his focus had shifted. She no longer represented anything he needed. Clare looked down at her hands, still manicured, still perfect, but now trembling slightly. Not with rage, but with realization. This wasn't a loss of popularity. It was the loss of relevance. And no one had to say a word. No one had to push her out. She had faded, quietly. It had taken only one night, one presence, one truth. All her posturing, all her years of silent power brokering, none of it could stand beside genuine integrity. The room kept moving forward, but Clare sat frozen in place, watching it all move without her. Keanu Reeves returned to his seat with the same unhurried grace he'd carried all evening. No triumphant gestures, no nods of victory. He simply pulled out his chair, sat down, and placed his hands in his lap. His expression was neutral, almost serene, as though nothing extraordinary had just happened. But everything had changed. Around him, the room breathed in a new rhythm. The murmurs that had followed Prince William's stunning announcement began to soften into silence. Guests stole glances at Keanu, but there was no gawking. It was a different kind of attention, rooted in reverence, not curiosity. A waiter brought him a glass of water, his hands slightly shaking as he placed it on the table. Keanu looked up and smiled, a genuine nod of thanks that disarmed the waiter's nerves instantly. That small gesture, so effortless, rippled through the space like a second wave of realization. His power didn't need volume, it didn't need force, it just was. Across the table, Clare sat rigid. Her champagne flute remained untouched, the bubbles rising and bursting quietly in her peripheral vision. She couldn't even pretend to sip it anymore. Her throat had tightened beyond control. She glanced around, searching for someone, anyone to meet her gaze. But it was as if the entire room had turned just slightly away. Not enough to be blatant, but enough to make the message clear. They weren't looking to her for guidance. Not anymore. Lord Ainsworth leaned slightly toward Keanu, whispering something that made the man chuckle gently. It wasn't a loud laugh, just a low sound of ease, like two old friends catching up after years apart. Clare recognized the body language. That wasn't a courtesy exchange. That was camaraderie. And she wasn't part of it. She shifted in her seat, trying to reassert her posture, spine straight, shoulders back. It was muscle memory, but it felt heavier now, like her body was resisting the old routine. It didn't carry the same effect. It didn't draw the same eyes. Keanu hadn't spoken a word all evening. Not a single defensive retort, not one public correction, not even a flinch when she'd mocked him. He had allowed her words to hang in the air, trusting they would unravel on their own. And they had. Now, in the silence that followed, he sat unbothered, surrounded by a growing respect that had nothing to do with money, titles, or legacy. It was earned, not demanded. Clare felt the temperature shift around her. Not the room's actual heat, but the social climate. It was like standing beneath a chandelier that had just gone out. A spotlight had been quietly removed, and the absence was louder than applause. Every movement she made felt exposed now. The lift of her chin, the adjustment of her dress strap, the tightening of her fingers around the clutch in her lap. These once calculated motions designed to communicate control now betrayed her unraveling. No one was watching, but she couldn't stop performing. That, she realized, was part of the problem. She had built her identity on being seen, admired, needed. She was the center of planning committees, the heart of guest lists, the gatekeeper of invitations that could shape careers and reputations. People needed her approval to feel they belonged. Now, no one was asking for it. She glanced across the room, watching conversations tilt toward Keanu's table. Guests leaned in, whispering not about the prince's speech, but about the quiet man who had somehow changed the entire tone of the gala without speaking more than a few words. The man who had allowed the evening to unfold without correcting a single misjudgment, trusting the truth to arrive in its own time. She recalled how earlier she had asked a waiter to correct the seating chart, confident that Keanu was out of place. Now she understood just how wrong she had been. He hadn't just been properly placed, he had been the one who made the seat itself matter. When Prince William had shaken his hand, it wasn't just symbolic. It had confirmed something unspoken. Keanu's presence was no accident. It was legacy. Not the kind inherited by bloodlines or family crests, but by action and intent. Keanu hadn't demanded acknowledgement. He hadn't corrected anyone. And yet, he had received more reverence in one evening than Clare had managed in years of curation and control. All because he was exactly who he claimed to be, nothing more, and certainly nothing less. Clare's eyes began to sting. She blinked quickly, trying to prevent the heat behind them from spilling over. Crying would only confirm what she already feared, that the image she'd so carefully protected was not just cracking, but dissolving. At the far end of the ballroom, a small group of young philanthropists gathered near the bar, discussing plans for expanding their outreach projects. Normally, they would have looked to Clare for approval or advice. She had mentored many of them in the past, showing them how to present themselves, who to align with, and when to speak. Tonight, they hadn't glanced in her direction once. One of them gestured subtly toward Keanu. The others nodded, their faces thoughtful. It was clear what was happening. They were recentering their compass, not toward flash or prestige, but toward quiet substance. And Keanu, in his stillness, had become that compass. Clare couldn't bear to watch anymore, but she couldn't look away either. Her world was shifting beneath her stilettos. She had come to the gala, expecting to elevate her influence. Instead, she was witnessing the complete recalibration of power, and she had no part in it. Not because Keanu had pushed her out, but because he hadn't needed to. As Keanu sat quietly, speaking to no one in particular, his presence filled the room more completely than any speech ever could. Clare, still frozen in her chair, felt the weight of something she couldn't control. Silence, not emptiness, but a mirror. In that stillness, she saw everything she had missed: grace, authenticity, patience. The room no longer orbited her. It pulsed around a man who had never asked for the center. For the first time in years, Clare felt small, not because she was overlooked, but because she had finally seen what real power looked like, humility fully realized. The ballroom had changed, not in lighting or decoration, but in energy. Conversations softened, laughter tempered. The grand chandelier above still sparkled, but the sparkle had shifted from the crystals to the man seated calmly near the center of the room. Whispers floated like ribbons through the air, curling between groups of guests who leaned in closer to each other, not to gossip, but to marvel. "Did you hear what Prince William said? I had no idea he was part of the foundation. Keanu Reeves. Imagine that. They weren't just curious. They were reflecting, regretting, reevaluating." Some looked down at their wine glasses, suddenly aware of how they'd laughed along when Clare had made her snide remarks. A few even exchanged glances that held the weight of silent apologies. They hadn't known. But ignorance no longer felt like an excuse. At the far corner of the ballroom, two women who had giggled at Clare's earlier jabs now whispered quietly to one another, their tones subdued. One of them finally said, "Maybe we were wrong to laugh." He didn't deserve that. Clare sat stiffly in her chair, her champagne untouched. Her body was still, but her phone buzzed constantly on the table. One text after another lit up her screen. From her assistant. "What's going on? People are asking questions." From a journalist friend. "Did you really mock Keanu Reeves at a royal event?" Sources buzzing. "Should I spin it?" From a foundation member. "This might not look good, Clare. Let me know if you need a quote drafted." Each message felt like a small slap. A reminder that perception, the very tool she had used to rise, was now turning on her like a tide she could no longer direct. She tapped the screen to silence the vibrations, but they kept coming. Around her, camera shutters began clicking again, but not in her direction. She turned, hopeful for a flash in her vicinity, but saw nothing. Instead, the photographers had repositioned. They now hovered near the table where Keanu sat, angled toward him and Prince William. They captured Keanu, smiling gently, shaking hands, posing graciously when asked. Every frame, every flash, wrote a new narrative, one where she was no longer the protagonist. Even Lord Ainsworth, once quick to hover at her elbow, was now at Keanu's side, engaged in a warm discussion. The shift was subtle but irreversible. The elite didn't abandon with drama. They drifted like silk on a breeze, away from scandal and toward relevance. And right now, Keanu was relevance. She reached for her champagne, hands trembling slightly, and took a small sip. It was flat. Across the room, a younger couple whispered while watching Keanu. The man nudged the woman. "You know he funds clinics in war zones? I read it last year." The woman nodded. "And he paid for an entire children's hospital wing in California. Quietly. Never took credit." Clare's ears burned. She had spent years mastering the art of attention, of curating moments that would go viral, of ensuring her name appeared in all the right columns. But this was different. Keanu hadn't chased a headline. The headlines chased him, and they were catching up. Clare stood, slowly, her heels clicking softly against the marble floor. A few heads turned not with admiration, but with polite curiosity. No one moved to greet her. No one smiled. She walked toward the hallway outside the ballroom, needing a breath, needing distance. But as she passed a group of guests near the floral arch, the whispers didn't pause, they intensified. "She's the one who mocked him, right? I can't believe she didn't know. She's usually so calculated." This was sloppy. The sting of each phrase pierced her carefully constructed image. She had always walked into rooms certain of her dominance. Tonight she had been the one holding court. Now, the court had changed rulers mid-banquet, and no one had warned her. She reached the hallway, leaned against the wall beside a sconce, and checked her phone again. More messages, one from her PR manager. "Damage control plan in progress. Suggest posting something humble as soon as possible. Call me." Another from a lifestyle blogger she frequently collaborated with. Saw the clip going around. Keanu didn't even flinch. That silence said more than a press release ever could. A clip. Her heart dropped. Somebody had caught it on video. Of course they had. The gala was packed with socialites, influencers, and low-key reporters. At least one of them must have been recording when she delivered her sarcastic line. The one about Keanu needing an extra plate. The one that had landed with laughter at the time. But now, with the new context, it would look brutal, cruel, completely out of touch. She closed her eyes and exhaled. Her brand had always thrived on being just the right mix of charming and sharp. A little bite, but never mean. She knew how to toe the line, but she had crossed it tonight, and not against a random guest. She had humiliated someone who turned out to be not only beloved, but deeply respected by the very institution hosting the event. She turned back toward the ballroom and saw the shift in its shape. Conversations orbited Keanu now. People formed subtle semicircles around him, not close enough to crowd, but near enough to show alignment. Even people she knew to be staunchly self-interested were nodding as he spoke. They weren't clout chasing. They were genuinely moved. Claire's phone buzzed again. A final message. This time, from someone she didn't expect. Her father. He rarely contacted her during events, but tonight, even he had seen the headlines. It read, "I taught you better than that." 4 words. She swallowed hard, throat dry, and locked her phone. Far across the room, Keanu rose to greet another donor. As he stood, a few people clapped quietly, not for a performance, but for presence. Prince William stood beside him, sharing a few quiet words. Before moving to another cluster of guests, the moment had fully shifted. Claire looked down at her gown, custom-made, perfectly fitted, painstakingly chosen for this night. Yet in this moment, it felt heavy, almost suffocating. No amount of tailoring could fix what was unraveling internally. She had lost something more valuable than attention. She had lost trust. And trust, she now understood, wasn't earned through charm or cleverness. It was earned in silence, in grace, in moments when you don't need to speak to be heard. And right now, everyone was listening to the man who said nothing at all. Claire moved down the corridor, her heels muffled against the plush runner, the noise of the ballroom fading behind her. She pushed open a door marked "Private" and entered a quiet hallway lined with ornate mirrors. It had always been her sanctuary during galas like this, a space to breathe, to regroup, to recenter before returning to the spotlight. But tonight, it felt different. The mirrors reflected back a version of her she no longer recognized. The same pearls glistened around her neck. The same designer gown hugged her silhouette. Her makeup was flawless. Every detail was as it should be, except for the eyes. They looked tired, distant, not the eyes of the woman who once ruled a room with a smirk and a sideways glance. She stepped closer, letting her fingertips touch the glass. The reflection didn't blink. It simply stared, hollow and silent. She tried to summon the old voice, the inner critic that could rewrite any moment, find the flaw in someone else, spin it back into power. But it had gone quiet. Behind her, through the walls, the sound of soft jazz and the occasional burst of laughter drifted down the hallway. The gala hadn't ended, it had just moved on. Without her, Claire sat on a bench beneath one of the mirrors and let her posture sag. For the first time in years, she stopped performing. She dropped the angle of her chin, let go of the tension in her shoulders, and allowed herself to feel the stillness. Her mind replayed the moment when the crowd turned. The way Lord Ainsworth had shifted his stance toward Keanu, the exact instant Prince William said his name. The collective intake of breath when it was announced that Keanu was now a co-owner of the Royal Horizon Foundation. It hadn't been loud. It hadn't needed to be. One sentence had undone her years of careful influence. She had spent so long thinking attention was the prize. But tonight, she realized attention was fleeting. What mattered was respect. And respect couldn't be demanded. It couldn't be manipulated. It had to be earned. And Keanu had earned it, not through connections or strategy, but through humility. She thought of her past appearances, the way she'd dominated interviews, how she'd crushed smaller players at luncheons with clever takedowns disguised as wit. She remembered standing at podiums, reveling in the power of her voice. But none of that had prepared her for what happened tonight. Because Keanu hadn't raised his voice, he hadn't fired back, he had simply waited. Let the evening unfold. Let her expose herself. The silence had done the work. She looked up at her reflection again. There was a flicker of something new. Not shame, not yet redemption, but awareness. She was seeing herself not as the world had seen her, but as she truly was, alone. And not because she had been outmaneuvered. She was alone because she had made a habit of rising by pushing others down. And now that there was someone she couldn't push, someone whose integrity absorbed rather than deflected, it had all come undone. Another burst of laughter echoed from the ballroom, followed by the clinking of champagne glasses. The sound stung. It reminded her that celebration was continuing, but not for her. She glanced at her phone, still buzzing with damage control texts and media inquiries. But she didn't answer. For once, she didn't have a response. Not yet. Not until she figured out who she really was without the stage, without the spotlight, without the illusion. She stood slowly, walked to the center of the hallway, and stared at the rows of mirrors surrounding her. So many versions of herself, all dressed in the same gown, all wearing the same mask. She reached up and unfastened the clasp of her necklace. The pearls slid into her palm, cool and silent. She didn't know why she took them off, only that she needed to. Clare paced the length of the mirrored hallway slowly now, barefoot, heels in one hand, pearls in the other. The rhythmic click of her shoes on the marble had always been a part of her entrance. Tonight, they felt like relics of a performance she could no longer keep up. For years, she had believed that grace came from control over the room, over perception, over people. But as she moved past her own reflection again and again, she saw the truth. Control had made her brittle, hollow, vulnerable in the one way she never wanted to be: disconnected from real respect. She had laughed at Keanu earlier, played to the crowd, whispered poison into the ears of donors who had once hung on her every word. But all it took was one moment of quiet dignity, one refusal to stoop to her level for everything to shift. Her empire hadn't been sturdy. It had been scaffolding held together by vanity and social leverage. She remembered the first time she had stepped into a gala like this, nervous, invisible, but determined. That younger version of herself would have been proud of what she'd built, but ashamed of how she'd lost it. And most of all, ashamed of who she had become to hold on to it. In the distance, she heard applause again. This time, not laughter, something warmer, deeper. A standing ovation, perhaps. She didn't need to see it to know who it was for. Keanu, of course. The man who didn't speak unless it mattered. The man who helped people without needing to be seen. The man whose quiet strength had just rewritten the room's entire definition of elegance. Clare leaned against the wall, head tilted back, eyes closed. She had never felt more exposed. And yet, in that vulnerability, she felt something break free. A realization. Power didn't reside in domination. It lived in presence. And she had spent too many years chasing the wrong kind. Clare turned once more toward the mirror, studying her own eyes. They weren't cruel or angry, just tired. Behind her, the sounds of celebration rose again. Keanu's name spoken with warmth, reverence, joy. He hadn't taken anything from her. He had simply shown the world what real strength looked like. And maybe that's what stung the most. Not that she had lost, but that she had never truly earned the place she'd fought to keep. As she adjusted her gown and picked up her heels, Clare whispered to herself softly, almost in awe, "I finally see it. I finally see him." Sometimes, the loudest voices in the room are the most fragile. Clare Alden had once believed her words were her power. That the way people paused when she entered, the way conversations turned when she spoke, was proof of her strength. But what she hadn't realized, what became painfully clear in a single evening, was that power built on fear, mockery, or status is paper thin. When the crowd had turned to Keanu Reeves, not for spectacle but for substance, Clare felt what it meant to be truly powerless. She had spent years building a fortress out of reputation, layering charm, sharp wit, and ruthless ambition. But the foundation was hollow. The moment the light shifted toward someone whose strength came from humility, not ego, her fortress crumbled. Keanu had never raised his voice. He never needed to defend himself. He didn't counter her sarcasm with revenge or try to outshine her cruelty. He simply existed as he was genuine, kind, and quietly dignified. And that, more than any retort or retaliation, was what disarmed the room. That's what made people lean forward and whisper his name with reverence. While Clare's laughter had filled the ballroom hours earlier, it was now Keanu's silence that echoed louder, not as an absence, but as a presence. The kind that stayed with people long after the music faded and the champagne stopped flowing. Prince William's choice to call attention to Keanu's contribution wasn't just royal formality. It was a deliberate act of acknowledgement. He had seen the same quiet strength that the rest of the room finally noticed. In a night filled with glitter and titles, the most respected man in the room was the one who asked for no attention at all. Clare's fall wasn't dramatic. No tears, no screaming exit, no headlines. Just a slow and steady unraveling of influence, as each person chose to turn towards someone else. As each text she sent went unanswered. As each smile she offered was met with polite distance. The room she once owned had found a new center. And the truth is, Clare wasn't the only one who judged too quickly. Many in that room had laughed with her, nodding along to her remarks, thinking they understood the pecking order. But Keanu didn't just surprise her, he surprised them all. He reminded them that goodness doesn't need to announce itself, that real power is often wrapped in humility, that character shines brightest when no one is watching, and still shines when everyone finally does. As the ballroom began to thin out, the story of the night had already written itself, not in headlines or paparazzi photos, but in the quiet realizations of everyone who had witnessed it. People would go home remembering how Clare's voice had filled the early evening and how it slowly faded into the background. And they'd remember how Keanu's presence, once barely noticed, had grown with each moment, not because he demanded it, but because he had earned it. A few guests whispered apologies to one another for laughing too soon, for assuming too much. Some left shaking their heads in quiet admiration for the man who never once stooped to pettiness. There had been no public shaming, no confrontation, no gotcha moment, just a gradual shift in the room's moral compass toward the man who never asked to be the center but had become it anyway. Prince William, too, had watched it all unfold. He had seen Keanu's calm response under pressure, his grace when tested, and the quiet dignity with which he held himself. And that was why, when the moment came to name a co-owner of the Royal Horizon Foundation, it wasn't a difficult choice, it was obvious. Keanu wasn't just the most qualified, he was the most worthy. Clare, by contrast, had misunderstood her role. She believed her charm and social standing would always protect her, but her influence had been conditional granted by others, not earned. And once the illusion cracked, there was no substance left to hold it together. Her reflection in the mirrored hallway, later that night, showed the same expensive pearls and sleek hairstyle, but the woman staring back at her felt unfamiliar. It wasn't the image that had changed. It was what sat behind the eyes, a hollow she couldn't fill with words anymore. That's the danger of building power on perception. In the end, this wasn't a story about revenge or comeuppance. It was a story about contrast. The contrast between status and substance, between noise and stillness, between performance and authenticity. Keanu didn't need to destroy Clare. He didn't need to prove anything. He just needed to be himself. And that, in a world that often rewards the loudest and flashiest, was revolutionary. So, what do we take away from this? True power doesn't come from being the smartest person in the room or the one with the sharpest tongue. It doesn't come from who you know or how loudly people clap when you speak. It comes from integrity, from being consistent when no one's watching, from choosing kindness when you could choose cruelty, from staying grounded when others float away on ego. Clare's fall wasn't because she was evil, it was because she forgot that power is borrowed, not owned. Respect must be earned, not demanded. And when someone like Keanu Reeves walks into your world, quiet and unassuming, you'd better look closely, because behind the silence might be someone who outshines everything you thought you knew. And maybe that's the heart of this incredible story. Now, let me ask you something personal. Have you ever judged someone too quickly and been proven wrong? Have you ever assumed someone's worth based on their appearance, their title, or their silence, only to realize they were carrying more depth, more strength, and more goodness than anyone else in the room? If so, share your story in the comments. Your voice matters here. And if you believe in the quiet power of kindness, if you believe that humility still has a place in our loud world, if you believe that people like Keanu Reeves remind us what true character looks like, then go ahead and like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share this story with someone who needs to hear it. Because sometimes, the most incredible stories aren't the ones shouted from rooftops. They're the ones whispered, with respect, carried home in silence, remembered forever. Thank you for watching. We'll see you in the next incredible story.